My relationship is really about the relationship that my family, in particular, my grandfather and Martin Luther King Sr., who is affectionately was known as Daddy King, and my mother, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, had with him. I had obviously several different encounters and opportunities to be in the presence of President Carter. But the relationship really started when he ran for governor of Georgia, and he called my grandfather, who was a very influential Baptist minister at the time, to get his support. And President Carter kind of credits my father in the movement for the reason he later became president. But in many respects, it started with Daddy King and him when he ran for governor. And of course, my grandfather gave him the support. He stood behind him when some people made certain attacks against him in terms of dealing with race and racism, because, at that time we were still coming out of the days of segregation and making a transition. But when my grandfather spoke up and spoke out, people took note of that, and obviously President Carter became governor of Georgia. And then later on, when he was running for president of the United States, he again solicited the support of the King family and got both my grandfather and my mother's support. They thought it would be important to support him going into the White House. And when he won that election, became president, before he became president, should I say, at the Democratic convention in 76, my grandfather was asked to deliver the benediction. It was such a resounding benediction. It went all over the world. And of course, he later got inaugurated as president, and we participated in that as well. I remember going to that inauguration, and I told myself at that time, that was 1977, so I would have been about 13, about to turn 14 a couple of months later. I said, I am never coming to another presidential inauguration because it was so cold and my feet were frozen. But of course, I later went to President Obama's first inauguration. But just fast forward, while he was serving as president, he did a lot of things, obviously, for the African American community, for the civil rights community, and in particular appointed a number of Black federal judges, as most of us know. And my mother was very instrumental with a group of other Black civil rights leaders in helping with some of the different nominations of people that they felt would serve in those positions, honorably. And then he appointed my mother as a delegate to the United Nations. So she served there for a short period of time. And that really opened her up to understanding, a little bit more about how things, operate in the world. And she developed so many new relationships and ended up being invited. And this is what I remember. She was invited because of the relationship and because of the work that obviously my father and her did, and their standing on apartheid. She was invited to give a speech before the United Nations, and couldn't do it, had gotten sick, and I actually delivered her speech. I think I want to say it was either 1979 or 1980. It was the first public speech that I had ever given in life, and then my world changed from there. But he was very instrumental in the helping to develop the Martin Luther King, which is now the National Historical Park. But at that time, he signed legislation for the Martin Luther King Jr. Historical Site, which was predominantly the birth home at the time. He helped to raise money to support the building of the King Center, $3.5 million to be exact. So, that's kind of how, that relationship began and evolved. And I remember specifically working on a site with him, Habitat for Humanity site. And it was remarkable because you don't expect a president, to literally roll up their sleeves and spend time, really digging in. And you could tell it was not a photo op. He was devoted to it. It wasn't, I'm in and out. He was really involved, and I was thoroughly impressed. And so, several years later, I had an opportunity, and this is like fast forward to maybe about, I want to say it's been about 7 years or so. I had an opportunity to interview him for the National Park Service. They did a special exhibit on him, and I had an opportunity to sit down in the room with him and interview him about his work and his legacy. And just such an humble man and genuine. And we need more leaders like that. And I was thoroughly impressed with the fact that this was a president that never dropped a bomb, never launched a missile, never fired a bullet, and that in and of itself is super remarkable, and is to be applauded. So great humanitarian, peace builder, and all of the work he did around eradicating certain diseases. And he lived such a rich and full life. I like to say, when I think about my faith and how he led out of his faith, in the Bible, there's a portion there near the end of Jesus's life on the cross where he says, "It is finished." And when I think about Jimmy Carter, I think about, you know, Jesus dying empty. In other words, he had finished his assignment, everything that he needed to do on earth. And Jimmy, if anybody really completed and emptied themselves out fully, it was President Jimmy Carter. Lived a very full, rich life. Um, and so, we remember him and we honor him. And I believe, in my personal opinion, he was the greatest president. I think for President Carter, a Southerner, to make such a statement about it now being the time to end racial segregation when another Southern governor a few years prior said segregation, uh, yesterday, today, and forevermore, being George Wallace. That was a courageous stance that he took. And the interesting thing is it wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't a political statement from him. It really came from his heart. He was a leader who led from conscience and from his heart. And so I think it played a significant role in opening up doors. And then he followed it up, as I said earlier, about appointing several African American federal judges, and just the work he did in opening up economic opportunities for the Black community. And so, yes, I mean, the irony, or I would say the what is the word I'm looking for? The just the comparison of one Southern governor to another, Alabama to Georgia. So he really, I think we could safely say that he helped to move Georgia to a different space and place, in the landscape of the South. And I think that's why right now, we kind of have a mixture of both political parties representing us in different ways. Two Democratic senators, a Republican governor, because he was able to transcend so many political boundaries. And so because he established that, Georgia has become better, but we obviously know that there's still a lot of work to do in a lot of parts of our state. But nonetheless, I think he helped to lay a strong foundation.
For a number of years, we have had an incredible relationship with President Carter and Mrs. Carter, and it goes back to my mother, as well as my grandfather, who had very close. My grandfather had a very close relationship with President Carter, certainly when he was governor. But as he ran for president, my grandfather was very instrumental, as was other members of our family, in encouraging people to support the ticket of President Carter and Vice President Mondale. I would also say that, over the years, and what I think about is there are very few persons who set the kind of example for what a public servant should be. When you talk about morality, when you talk about spirituality, when you talk about character, if you would look up any of those words, you'd probably find a picture of Jimmy Carter, because that's who he was. But he was one of the greatest humanitarians that our nation and world have ever seen. When you think about the fact that even when he completed his term, his 4-year term, although he ran a second term and was not successful, he began to go all over the nation building houses with Habitat for Humanity, he and Mrs. Carter. And then, of course, he traveled to places around the world where democracy was engaged, and he was led observers in monitoring elections around the world, promoting democracy. When we think about President Carter and what he represents to Georgia, the nation, and the world, it is really phenomenal. He is someone who set an example that, I mean, when you think about it, as a president, any president, that's one of the hardest jobs on planet Earth, a president of the United States. So if a president chose to just coast and rest after he or she have served their time, that would be fine. But here is a man and his wife who never stopped. They every day were working to make the nation and world better. And in addition to that, we know he taught Sunday school on a consistent basis. He didn't just superficially wear his faith. He wore it each and every day, setting a standard and an example that all of us could follow. Well, I think when you talk about one who was courageous and essentially was always involved in the concept of truth to power. In other words, I'm going to tell what I believe is true, whether anyone else believes it or supports it or not. But as a leader, I have an obligation to lead. And that's what he did throughout his life in every decision, whether it was civil rights, whether it was healthcare, whether it was education. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to have known President Carter during his term in office. I had an opportunity to represent the United States in a delegation that went to the Congo, Brazzaville, the Belgian Congo, for a centennial celebration. And I was in a delegation of about 20 to 25 people. And President Carter asked me to go along with that delegation. And I was honored to be a part of that. But there were so many things, when I think of President Carter and what he did and the climate that he created, he and Mrs. Carter worked to create a better nation and world. And literally, they did that probably every day of their lives.